we are going to look at a battle for funding Ukraine in the EU. Last month, in December, the EU introduced a proposal for a 4-year, 50 billion euro aid package for Ukraine, plus 20 billion euros specifically for military aid. Now, most of the countries here are completely on board, except
Which one?
one holdout, Hungary.
What a shocker.
So Hungary has been in democratic backsliding for about 15 years now, ever since their president, Viktor Orban, has come to power. And in December, Orban made Hungary the one country to veto the EU's aid proposal. His excuse was that EU money shouldn't go to countries outside the EU. And this has been a pattern for a long time, as the EU has been trying to fund Ukraine since the beginning of their war with Russia, that Orban has constantly kind of held things up, slowed down the process. And even with that, so far the EU has given over $70 billion worth of support to Ukraine. So while Orban gives the reason of not wanting to give EU money to another country, the real reason is that he's quite close with the China-Russia axis. Hungary has been wooing Chinese and Russian investment since Orban came into office. It's investing in a manufacturing economy, and a lot of the money to support that has come from China over the past decade and a half. And plus, to fuel that kind of economic development, they want cheap energy. Where to get cheap energy when you're Hungary? Russia, through oil and natural gas. So Hungary is one of a small group of countries that fought against a ban on Russian oil imports into the EU after the Ukraine war so that they could still have that coming in. Western officials have noted Orban's close relationship with Putin, and they think he's leveraging that relationship to get concessions favorable for Hungary in other areas. So the idea is the West sees that Orban is close with Putin. They know that they kind of have to pony up to Orban and give Hungary concessions to get him to let proposals through the EU, to basically allow them to govern as a bloc. Orban has gone to the brink with the EU lots of times to extract favorable deals. And the thing is, it keeps working, right? The EU is set up so that any country can veto one of their proposals. And Orban has done that many times. And the EU has a mechanism themselves that they can kind of use to counter him, where they can withhold funding, which is important. Hungary is one of the countries that takes the most money from the EU on a per capita basis to fuel its economy. And a lot of the foreign direct investment it gets is based on these other countries knowing that it will be supported by EU funding.
And we've seen this happen also with Poland, right? So
Yep.
Poland was also on a democratic backslide with the Peace and Justice Party?
Yes.
Yeah, the Peace and Justice Party. They stacked the courts in their favor. They did all these things. They had prosecutors in parliament, which you can't do. A bunch of stuff. We had people who were arrested for corruption inside of official buildings. Crazy stuff. Now, the European Union withheld like $100 billion, 100 billion euros from Poland because of all this democratic backsliding. Now the new prime minister of Poland, Donald Tusk, is working to do reforms to get that 100 billion into Poland.
Yep. Hungary
is not doing anything to get their money from the EU. They're accepting that this is their punishment for the politics they want to do.
Well, they're not only accepting it. Orban has been ramping up the vetoes.
Right.
He's been doing them more and more often to try to put more pressure back on the bloc. So it gets them in this sticky situation, and more European leaders are getting frustrated with Orban. They want to be able to pass their reforms and their proposals, and it got to the point where last week a document was leaked to the Financial Times where it was outlining a plan to damage or potentially cripple Hungary's economy if Orban tried to veto the plan again.
Wow.
So it says that the document said that heads of state would...
Wait, let me interrupt you.
Yeah, go.
So you're saying the plan referring to the Ukraine funding package?
Yes, if Orban vetoes the Ukraine funding.
Got it.
Yeah, then they'll they'll try to go after Hungary's economy. The heads of state would declare publicly that they cannot imagine that EU funds would be given to Hungary in light of its disruptions. And this seemed to have an effect, kind of the desired effect, where Hungary's EU minister responded with more openness to an EU plan to fund Ukraine, as long as Hungary could change its mind at a later date. So the take here is, Hungary wants enough power so that they can keep going back to the negotiating table, extracting more concessions from the EU every time it wants to fund Ukraine.
Yep.
The instant reaction that I read about from other European leaders is there's no way Orban is going to get the opportunity to veto this repeatedly year after year. So it's difficult. I think this is going to get Ukraine funding to go through. Obviously, this is also happening at a time where our version of Orban here, which is House Republicans, are preventing any Ukraine funding from coming to from the U.S., and that's also enabling Orban or any other far-right leader who comes into power in Europe to block funding coming from the EU, right? It makes it more normalized. So they're kind of completely stuck right now. But I think the European diplomats coming up with this plan to destroy Hungary's economy, even going this far as drawing up the document and leaking it, is kind of the necessary hardball that they need to play when they're dealing with a strong man like Orban.
I totally agree. You got to make these, if you are in this type of union of countries working together, you have to make sure that the countries are following the principles of your organization or cripple them out.
Yeah.
Right? Otherwise, don't be in it.
Yeah.
And Hungary needs the European Union.
Totally.
Right. Hungary needs it. The same way that Mississippi and Alabama hate the federal government, they need the federal government.
Yes.
Right. They need the federal government. They are the states that are most likely to receive money from the federal government. They need it much more than we need them. And Hungary is in that same position.
Yes. And so the EU should impose their values. I mean, we're both completely for the EU imposing their values on Hungary to condition their support on.
Yeah.
I guess the question is, does it make the alliance or the group, the bloc, seem kind of untenable? Because Orban is not the only populist leader that we have in the EU. We have Geert Wilders, who's just elected the leader of the Netherlands, who is a total Eurosceptic. We have the AfD in Germany, which we talk about all the time, which would totally love to leave the EU. There's Marine Le Pen's party in France that is kind of aligned the same way. We have Poland, which only just fell out of power because Tusk got elected. It seems hard to maintain. They want to keep power as a bloc and have it based on these fundamental values like rule of law, but if each individual country is still going to have democratically elected leaders, and democratic elections can lead to populist leaders that don't want to be part of the bloc or operate upon those fundamental values, are you just constantly have to battle those leaders that are elected in the individual countries?
Well, I think the only way to look at it is through the lens of the United States, because the United States, for all the things that we do wrong, one of the things that we've been able to do is keep ourselves together for around 250 years minus one civil war that killed 2% of our population. So besides that, we've had a fairly stable country.
Yeah.
Now, but the United States deals with this all the time. The United States always deals with rogue governors and having to impose the rule of law. Think back to the enforcement of Brown v. Board with the integration of schools. Eisenhower needed to bring I think either the 101st or 82nd Airborne Division to escort black kids to schools in protest against the governors who weren't going to let them in. Kennedy had to send people down to face down George Wallace with the University of Alabama stuff. So yes, you just have to play hardball, and the federal government can't be weak. The federal government in the EU, the federal government in the United States cannot be weak against these rejections of your group's liberal rule of law-based principles.
Yeah.
You just got to come down hard and make them feel the pain when they don't follow these rules.
Yeah, and I guess it kind of a pro and a strength and a weakness of the EU versus the US is that in the US we have the federal government has all of the law on its side to crack down when a governor doesn't align with them, right? The EU, not so much. It's a looser coalition.
The EU doesn't have a supremacy clause.
No.
The Constitution is supreme to all other local, state level legislation. All of it is underneath the Constitution and federal statutes and federal judgments. It's not the case in Europe.
No.
That's something that they have to change if they want a more stable system.
Yes, but I think it's a strength because it means you're not really risking civil war amongst the EU. What you're risking is something like Brexit. Right? And Brexit is probably the best advertisement that the EU has ever gotten.
Yeah, they're like, oh man, you leave, your economy will become enormously worse.
Yeah, I just listened to a podcast today that was talking about how prices in Britain and profit margins have all gone down significantly because of poorer trade conditions with the EU.
Of course.
Which is so obvious.
Their biggest import and export partner, they just put up a bunch of trade barriers with them that they didn't need to be there.
Exactly. Yeah, it doesn't help anybody. The one other perspective I want to talk about on this is the weakness of this strategy from other European leaders in that Eurosceptic parties like the AfD in Germany, right? They're going to be able to look at this and they're going to be able to kind of paint the EU as the big bad Goliath that's stepping on Hungary, the little guy, and who's threatening to just completely cripple their economy because the reasons won't matter. Like they won't even get to the ears of the audience. It'll just be, what the heck? The EU is trying to ruin Hungary. They're just Hungary. And I think that is going to provide them with fuel. It just goes to show how clear the communication has to be of why they're doing this, why Ukraine funding is so important, how Orban has been completely on his own in vetoing that Ukraine aid, how he is the rogue actor. It's not the EU trying to go after him.
Yes. I will say it makes it a lot harder when the thing that you're pushing, the EU is pushing down hard on Hungary for Ukraine funding. United States pushing really hard on a state front, integrating schools is a way easier a fight to have in the media.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So the EU is going to have a hard thing to sell to people. Like, no, we need to, like, we're threatening to crush this member state's economy for the sake of a nation that's not a member of our union. That's a hard sell.
True. And in that way, it also does help Putin. It helps Russia by showing a disunited front on the West, right? I think one of the West's biggest strengths when Russia first invaded Ukraine is that we had a clear good guy, bad guy situation, right? It made all the sense in the world to give all of the funding to Ukraine for moral, for ethical reasons, just as much as national security reasons.
Geostrategic.
Exactly. But now when Hungary pushes back, suddenly it seems like it's a murkier picture. Like we don't actually know who good and bad is. If Hungary is part of the EU, but they're also friendly with Russia and they want to hold back on Ukraine aid, are we sure that Ukraine aid is necessarily such a good thing to do? And Putin and Russian media uses that. They call out and they show what Orban is doing to support themselves. So that's where, like, some people have said that it doesn't matter that Orban, like, protests these things publicly, protests Ukraine aid publicly, as long as he comes around in the end and does the right things as far as dropping the veto. But the truth is, this is an information war that's constantly going on.
Yeah.
And by giving this resistance to the EU, Orban is giving more ammunition in that information war to Putin.
To Putin, to the AfD, to the VDD, in the Netherlands, to the Vox Party in Spain. All of those parties gain from Hungary doing this.